They gave him the worst tent in the compound. That's the first thing you should know about Marcus Deel. Not the second worst, the worst. The one near the generator where the noise never stopped and the ground stayed wet even in the dry season because the runoff pooled there. Nobody wanted it, so they gave it to the Mapmaker. I remember the day he arrived because I was on gate duty and I almost sent him back. He came off the supply bird with a duffel and a hard case the size of a coffin, and when I asked what was in it, he said instruments, like that explained anything. He wasn't big. He wasn't loud. He had these thick glasses that fogged the second he stepped off the ramp, and he stood there wiping them on his shirt while the rotor washed blue grit into everything. A survey mapmaker. That was his job, not a shooter, not a medic, not comms. He drew lines on paper. You have to understand what that meant in a place like Firebase Ellery. We were tucked into the folds of the Tallman Range, which is about the most unforgiving stretch of rock you can imagine, cold at night, brutal in the sun, and cut through with these deep gorges that swallowed patrols whole. We'd lost people in that terrain, not to fighting, to the terrain itself. A wrong turn on a ridge, a rope that came up short, a map that said one thing while the ground said another. The maps we had were garbage. Old imagery, a lot of it decades out of date. Whole valleys marked wrong. Roads that had washed out in some flood nobody bothered to record. We were operating in a place that had never really been measured, not properly, and every mission we ran was half guesswork and prayer. So on paper, Deel should have been the most important man on that base. He was the least respected. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I was part of it. The first week, guys would ask him to move his instruments so they could set up a horseshoe pit. They'd knock his tent stakes loose by accident. Someone drew a little cartoon on his door of a stick figure with a magnifying glass and wrote, "The Professor," underneath. He never said anything about any of it. He'd just fix his stakes, move his gear, and go back to whatever he was doing. What he was doing, mostly, was walking. That's the part that made no sense to us at first. He'd get up before the sun, before even the cooks, and he'd take that hard case and one of the beat-up mules and he'd just go. Out past the wire, up into the folds. Alone at first until the sergeant major found out and lost his mind about it and assigned him a two-man escort. I pulled that duty 3 times. I hated it. I thought it was babysitting. I was wrong about that, like I was wrong about most things concerning Marcus Deel. But I didn't know it yet. The first time I really looked at him, we were up on a saddle between 2 peaks, and he'd been standing at his tripod for maybe 40 minutes without moving. I got bored. I got cold. I walked over to complain, and I saw what he was writing in his notebook, and it stopped me. It wasn't just numbers. It was, I don't know how to describe it. He'd sketched the whole valley below us, every fold and drainage, and next to each feature he'd written little notes. Loose scree, dry season only. Old wall, possibly a terrace, means water once ran here. Copper stain on the north face, old works. What's that mean? I asked him. Copper stain. He didn't look up. Means somebody dug here, a long time ago. Where there's old mining, there's old access, trails, cuts through the rock that men made because the natural way was worse. So, he looked at me then. He had this steady way of looking that made you feel like he was measuring you the same way he measured the mountains. So a trail that a mule train used 200 years ago will still get a man through today. The mountain doesn't care what year it is. If it worked then, it works now. You just have to find where it went. I laughed. I actually laughed at him. You're gonna win this war with a 200-year-old donkey path. He went back to his notebook. I'm not going to win anything, he said. I'm going to draw where things are. What everybody does after that isn't up to me. I want you to hold onto that line. Because that's the whole man right there. He didn't want the credit. He didn't want the glory. He wanted the map to be correct. That was the whole of his ambition, and it turned out that was the rarest and most valuable thing on that mountain. The problem came to a head about 6 weeks in. We had a patrol go out into the eastern gorges, the Serrat drainage, we called it, chasing a supply route that command was sure was being used to move materiel through our sector. 12 men. Good men. Their maps put a passable trail along the gorge floor. There was no trail. The map was wrong. What was actually down there was a bottleneck, a place where the walls came in tight and the floor turned to boulder and they got strung out and stuck and it went bad in the worst way. We got most of them back. We didn't get all of them. I won't dress that up. It was a hard week. The base went quiet the way it does. And there was a lot of anger looking for a place to land, and some of it landed on Deel because Deel was the map guy and the map had killed people. That's not fair. He hadn't drawn that map. Nobody had drawn that map. It was old imagery some analyst had traced 2,000 miles away. But grief doesn't do fair. I remember the night one of the team leaders, a big hard sergeant named Prewitt, cornered him outside the mess, got right in his face. "You're the Mapmaker," Prewitt said, and his voice was shaking. "Where were you? Huh, you're up on your little hills drawing your little pictures, and my guys are down in that ditch." Deel took it, didn't flinch, didn't argue. And when Prewitt finally ran out of words, Deel said something very quiet that I only half heard. He said, "I've been down in the Serat. Give me a minute." And he went into his terrible tent by the generator, and he came out with a rolled sheet, and he unrolled it on the mess table under the light, and the whole room went still. It was the Serat drainage, all of it, hand-drawn to scale from measurements he'd taken himself on those solo walks everyone laughed at. The bottleneck was marked in red, impassable with load, it said. And beside it, running up along the north wall, was a thin line he'd drawn in a color I'll never forget. Copper, he'd used a copper-colored pencil, because he'd traced it off the old mine workings. "There's a bench up here," he said, and his finger followed the line. "Old ore road, it's narrow but it's solid and it stays above the choke point. If they'd been on this line, they'd have walked right over the trouble and never known it was there." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Prewitt looked at that copper-colored line like it was a ghost. "Why didn't we have this?" he said, but the anger was gone out of him. It was just tired now and something underneath it that I think was shame. "You have it now," Deel said. He rolled it back up. He didn't make it a bigger moment than it needed to be. He just left it on the table and walked back to his tent. That was the night everything started to turn, though it turned slow. People don't change their minds fast about someone they've decided not to respect. But that copper line got into people's heads. Somebody, I think it was Prewitt himself, started calling it that. Not the ore road, not Deel's route, the copper line. And the next mission that mattered, they ran it on the copper line. Here's the thing about that first mission on his route, and I was on it, so I'm not telling you secondhand. We went back into the Serat. Different objective, but the same country that had eaten our people. And I will tell you honestly, every man on that patrol was scared, and we didn't hide it from each other. You don't, after a week like the one we'd had. We went in at last light with Deel's map and Prewitt out front, and every 100 meters somebody would check the sheet against the ground. And the ground matched. You have no idea what that does to you until you've spent months in country where the map lies. Every feature Deel had drawn was there. The old terrace wall, the copper stain on the north face, and when we came to the choke point, the same tight boulder-choked hell that had trapped our guys, his copper line lifted us up onto that narrow bench, and we walked above the whole thing. Solid rock under our boots, the trouble passing beneath us in the dark like a river we'd found a bridge over. We made the objective, and we came home with everyone we left with, first time in a while. When we got back, Deel wasn't even up to see it. It was the middle of the night. His tent light was off. But somebody, and I swear it wasn't me, though I wished later it had been, somebody went and rubbed out that stick figure cartoon on his door. The professor one just wiped it off. That was mission 1. There would be 22 more. Word travels fast on a firebase. By the time the Serat patrol got back, half of Ellery knew that the Mapmaker's route had worked, and the other half heard about it by breakfast. But knowing a thing and believing it are different animals, and there were plenty who still figured it was luck. Deel didn't argue with them, he just kept walking. The difference now was that people started walking with him, not to guard him, to learn. Prewitt was the first, which surprised me given how they'd started. He'd show up at Deel's tent before dawn and stand there awkwardly with 2 cups of coffee and hand one over, and the 2 of them would head out into the folds without saying much. Prewitt told me later what those mornings were like. "He doesn't look at the ground the way we do," Prewitt said. "We see a slope. He sees history. He sees water that ran 1,000 years ago and where it must have gone. He sees where men would have built because that's where you'd build. It's like he's reading a book the rest of us can't even see the pages of." That was Deel's gift, if you want to call it that. He didn't think about the mountain as an obstacle. He thought about it as a record. Everything that had ever happened up there had left a mark, and he could read the marks. An old wall meant old water. Old water meant an old route because people go where the water is. A copper stain meant old digging, and old digging meant somebody had already solved the hard problem of getting through, centuries ago, and all Deel had to do was find where they'd solved it. He explained it to me once, on one of the escorts, and I finally understood why he was the way he was. Everybody wants to be the one who does the brave thing, he said. The thing people cheer for, and that's fine, we need those men, but somebody has to know where the ground is. Somebody has to be right about the ground when everybody else is guessing. That's not a job that gets you cheered. It's a job that gets people home. I decided a long time ago I'd rather do the second one. I asked him why he cared so much when the mountain didn't care about him and half the base didn't either. He was quiet for a while, then he said, I had a brother. And he didn't finish it, he didn't have to. I've thought about that unfinished sentence more times than I can count. The mission started stacking up. Mission 2 was a resupply route into a forward position that had been getting its convoys ambushed on the only road anyone thought existed. Deel found a second way in an old drover's track along a ridgeline that kept the convoys off the valley floor and out of the kill zones. The ambushes stopped, not slowed, stopped, because you can't ambush a road nobody knew was there. Mission 3 was an evacuation. A recon element got pinned up on a plateau after their planned exit got cut off, and the only way anybody could see to reach them was straight up a face that would have taken hours we didn't have. Deel had walked that plateau. He knew there was a chimney, a natural cleft in the rock on the backside, from some old survey mark he'd found scratched into the stone by God knows who, God knows when. The rescue team went up the chimney. They had the recon element out before dark. By mission 5 or 6, the whole culture of the base had shifted. When a patrol was being planned, the first question stopped being, what's the objective? It became, what does Deel's map say? His hand-drawn sheets, and he was drawing constantly now, filling in more of the range every week, became the most valuable paper on Ellery. People guarded them, copied them by hand so there'd be backups. There was a run of about 10 days where the imagery-based maps just quietly disappeared from the planning tent, and nobody said a word about it. We'd stopped using them. We used the Mapmaker's country now. And the copper line, his original route, the ore road above the Sarat choke, became a kind of legend in its own right. Guys who ran it came back and talked about it like it was a friend. We took the copper line, they'd say, and everyone knew what they meant. It meant we found the way through that the mountain had been hiding. It became shorthand for the whole idea, for trusting the man who read the ground. I want to tell you about the night it almost went wrong, because it's important, and because it shows you who Deel really was. There was a mission, I think it was the 11th or 12th on his routes, where a team leader got greedy. He looked at Deel's map and saw a shortcut Deel hadn't drawn as passable, a saddle that would have cut 2 hours off the approach. Deel had marked it, in red, do not use undercut ledge unstable, but the team leader figured that was just the mapmaker being cautious. 2 hours is 2 hours. Deel found out about it while they were already moving. He was in the comms tent. He'd started sitting in on missions that used his routes, quietly in the back, in case anybody needed to ask him about the ground in real time. When he heard where they were headed, he stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. They can't go over that saddle, he said. Get them off it. The whole north lip is undercut. It'll go. The comms sergeant looked at him like he was overreacting. It was just a line on a map. Deel grabbed the handset himself, which he was absolutely not supposed to do, and he got the team leader and he said in this flat, dead-level voice, "This is Deel. Do not cross the north saddle. The ledge is hollow underneath. I've stood on it. I could feel it move. Take the long way. That's not a suggestion." There was a long pause on the radio, and the team leader took the long way. 2 days later, a rockslide took out the entire north lip of that saddle, the exact stretch he'd wanted to cross. Tons of it gone down into the gorge. If those men had been on it, they'd have gone with it. Nobody laughed at the professor after that, not ever again. But here's what I remember most about that night. After it was over, after the team was safely on the long route, Deel picked up his chair and set it back at the table and sat down. And his hands were shaking, just slightly. This man who never showed anything, whose voice had been dead-level steel on the radio, his hands were shaking under the table where he thought nobody could see. I saw I was sitting next to him. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand on his shoulder for a second, and he looked at me, and there was so much in his face, relief, and something older and heavier that I think went all the way back to that brother he never finished telling me about. "I could feel it move," he said again, very quietly, mostly to himself, "when I stood on it. I could feel it wanting to go. That's the difference between reading a map and knowing the ground. Deel didn't just draw the mountain. He'd been everywhere he drew. He'd felt the hollow ledge shift under his own boots. Every line on his maps was paid for with his own feet, his own risk, all those solo dawn walks everyone had mocked. He wasn't guessing about what would kill you. He knew because he'd gone and found out first alone so that nobody else would have to. By then we were maybe halfway to 23. I didn't know the number yet. Nobody did. But looking back, that saddle was the turning point. That was when the copper line stopped being a route and became a promise. When Deel said the ground was safe, men walked it without a second thought. When he said stay off, they stayed off. His word became the difference between coming home and not. And the mountain, which had been our enemy longer than any human ever was, the mountain started to feel like something we finally understood. Because one quiet man with thick glasses and a copper-colored pencil had gone out, alone, morning after morning, and learned its secrets one boot step at a time. The winter was when the copper line proved what it really was. I don't think people who haven't been in high mountains understand what winter does up there. The whole country changes. Routes that are easy in summer become death traps. Snow fills the gorges and hides the ground. The temperature drops to where exposed skin goes numb in minutes and metal sticks to flesh. And the maps, even good maps, become half useless, because they show you the summer mountain, and the winter mountain is a different animal wearing the same skin. Deel had thought about this before any of us did. Of course he had. He'd spent the autumn rewalking his most important routes in the early snow, taking new measurements, drawing what he called his winter overlays, the same country, but with notes about which slopes would slide, which drainages would fill, which passes would close, where the wind stripped the snow and where it piled it deep enough to bury a man standing up. He'd figured out that his old ore roads, the mining routes, tended to stay usable in winter because the old miners had built them to be worked year-round. The men who'd cut the copper line 2 centuries ago had needed to move ore in every season, so they'd chosen ground that didn't slide. They already solved winter, Deel told me. I just have to not forget what they figured out. That winter we ran mission after mission on his routes when nobody else could move at all. There was a stretch in the deep cold where the conventional wisdom said the whole range was locked, impassable, wait for spring. And we were quietly still operating because the Mapmaker had winter roads nobody else knew existed. Mission 15, in the worst of it, was the one they still talk about. A medical emergency at a forward observation post. One of the men up there had gone down hard. I don't even remember with what now, some internal thing, the kind of thing where hours matter and days kill. And the post was snowed in. The helicopters couldn't get up in the weather. The ceiling was on the deck and the winds were screaming through the passes. The only summer route in was buried under avalanche-prone snow. Command was, I think, genuinely preparing to lose that man. There just wasn't a way. Deel spread his winter overlay on the table and found one. It was insane. It was a chain of 3 old mining benches connected by a saddle the wind kept scoured clear, running up the leeward side of the range where the slide danger was lowest. It had never been used as a route by anyone in our time. But the copper miners had linked those benches, and Deel had walked the connections in the autumn snow, and he was sure, not hopeful, sure, that a team on foot could reach the post and carry the man out. And then he did the thing that changed how I think about courage forever. He said, I'm going with them. The sergeant major told him no, flat no. You're the Mapmaker, you're too valuable, we can't lose you on a mountain. And Deel, quiet Deel, who never pushed back on anyone about anything, looked at him and said, then I'm too valuable to send men up there without me. The overlay is good, but it's new. If the winds change the snow, I'll see it, and they won't. I've stood on every foot of that ground. They haven't. You send them alone and something goes wrong, they'll be trusting paper. You send me, they'll be trusting a man who knows. I'm going. He went. I wasn't on that one. I've never been more sorry to have missed anything in my life. But Prewitt was, and Prewitt told me every detail more than once, always with this look on his face like he still couldn't quite believe it. They went up in weather that would kill you for a mistake. And the whole way, Prewitt said, Deel was reading the mountain in real time, stopping the team, changing the line by a few meters here and there, pointing at a slope and saying, not that, the winds loaded it, go low. At one point he stopped them cold on a bench and made them wait 20 minutes for no reason any of them could see. And then a slab of snow the size of a house let go off the face above and swept across the exact ground they'd have been standing on. He'd felt it coming. In the sound of the snow, in the way the surface had changed. Something. They reached the post. They got the sick man onto a litter, and they carried him out down the copper miners' benches, in the dark, in the wind, and they got him to where a bird could finally reach him at first light. He lived. That man is alive today because 200 years ago some forgotten miners cut a road to move copper, and because one underestimated mapmaker spent his mornings walking it so he'd know it when it mattered. When they got back, the whole base turned out, even in the cold, even at that hour, and they were cheering for the rescue team and for the man they'd saved, and yeah, finally for Deel. And Deel walked through all of it with his head down, the way he always did, and he went to his terrible tent by the generator, and he did not come out to be celebrated. I found him in there an hour later. He was sitting on his cot with his boots still on, still crusted with snow, and he was crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just sitting there with tears running down his face, exhausted, wrung out. I started to back out. He said, "It's all right, stay." So I sat down across from him, and I waited. And finally, he told me the rest of the sentence he'd left unfinished all those months before. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger. We were on a mountain together years ago, not like this, just the two of us climbing the way you do when you're young and stupid and think you're safe. And there was a way through I wasn't sure about, and a way around that would have taken longer, and I was tired, and I picked the fast way. And the ground gave out, and I couldn't." He stopped. He didn't finish that one either. He didn't need to. "I know the ground now," he said after a while, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I make sure I know it, every foot. Because I didn't know it once, and it cost me the only person he shook his head. So when I stand up in that comms tent and tell them do not cross the saddle, do not trust the summer map, take the long way, I'm not being careful. I'm keeping a promise. To him, I don't let the ground take anybody else, not if I can walk it first. I have thought about that conversation for the rest of my life. Every one of those missions, the resupplies, the evacuations, the rescue in the deep cold, every single one the whole time he was carrying his brother up those mountains with him. All that quiet, all that refusal to be celebrated. It was never modesty. It was grief that had found the only job that could hold it. He wasn't drawing maps. He was making sure no one else lost what he had lost. Spring came, and with it the missions kept coming, and the number kept climbing, though I still didn't know we were counting toward anything. 16, 17, 18, each one on ground Deel had walked and drawn and vouched for. By now his reputation had spread past our firebase entirely. Other units heard about the mapmaker at Ellery who had routes through country everyone else called impassable. They started requesting copies of his maps. They started requesting him for consults for planning. Command tried to pull him out to a headquarters element once, to put him somewhere more strategic, and the whole base practically mutinied. Prewitt led a delegation to the sergeant major to say, in essence, over our dead bodies. Deel stayed. But something was changing in him, and I was close enough by then to see it. He was tired, not the ordinary tired, something deeper. He'd been walking those mountains alone for the better part of a year in every season, carrying that hard case and that grief, and it had worn a groove in him. His hands had started to shake a little more often, and not just from cold. He'd developed a cough in the winter that never fully went away. He was, I think, using himself up. Spending himself on the ground the way he'd always spent himself, except now there was less of him to spend. I told him once he should slow down, let the escorts do more of the walking. He'd trained a couple of the younger guys well enough to take basic measurements by then. He shook his head. "They can measure," he said. "They can't feel it yet. The feeling comes from your own feet over time. I don't have the time to give them the time." And he coughed, and he smiled a little, and he went out walking the next morning like always. Mission 19 was the one where the copper line, the original, the ore road above the Sarat choke, the one that had started everything, saved the most lives at once. There was a large movement planned through the eastern sector. More men than we usually moved together, heading to reinforce a position that was under real pressure. The direct route ran the valley floor, and intelligence was increasingly certain the valley floor was compromised, that if we put that many men on it, they'd be walking into something bad. Deel's answer was the copper line. The whole column, all of them, up onto the old ore road above the Sarat, the same bench that had carried that first frightened patrol over the choke point months before. Except now Deel had extended it. He'd spent weeks connecting the original copper line to a whole network of old workings running east. A hidden highway through the mountains that ran above and around every dangerous stretch of the valley floor. The column moved on his network, above the compromised ground the entire way. They reached the position that needed them in time and intact, and every man who studied it afterward agreed the valley route would have been a disaster. That was the mission where somebody in command finally did the arithmetic. Went back through the logs, counted every operation that had run on Deel's route since that first night in the mess hall, and the number came back 23. 23 missions, resupplies that stopped getting ambushed, evacuations that reached the unreachable, a rescue in the deep cold that should have been impossible. A column of reinforcements walked safely over a valley that would have swallowed them. 23 missions that had, between them, quite literally changed the shape of the whole campaign in our sector. All of them traced back to one man's copper-colored pencil and one man's boots on ground nobody else would walk. They wanted to give him a medal. He almost didn't take it. I know because I was there when the sergeant major told him, and Deel's first response was to look uncomfortable and say, "For what? For drawing?" And the sergeant major, who was not a soft man, got a little rough in the voice and said, "For 23 missions, Deel, for every man who came home who wasn't going to, take the damn medal. It's not for you. It's for them so they have somewhere to put it." That got him, so they have somewhere to put it. Deel understood that. All the gratitude of all those men who'd come home, it needed a place to land, and the medal was the place. He took it for their sake, not his own. Of course he did. It was the only way he'd ever taken anything. The ceremony was small. We didn't do big up there. But the whole base came, the way they had the night of the winter rescue, and this time Deel didn't hide in his tent. He stood there in the thin spring sun while they read out the 23, and I watched his face the whole time, and I saw him doing the thing he always did, carrying his brother through it. When they finished reading, he was quiet for a second, and then he said just a few words. He said, "I didn't make these roads. Men I never met made them a long time ago, and then everybody forgot. All I did was walk until I found where they went. That's all any of this is. Somebody has to remember the ground. Somebody has to walk it and remember. If you take one thing from me, take that. When it matters, don't trust the picture somebody traced from far away. Go and stand on it. Feel whether it'll hold, then you'll know." And he stepped back, and that was the whole speech. Pruitt was standing next to me. This big, hard sergeant who'd once shoved Deel against a wall in his grief. And Pruitt was crying openly, not caring who saw. "I called him the professor," Pruitt said to me low. "First week, I drew that stupid cartoon on his door. I did that." He wiped his face. "And he carried my whole team over the Sarat and never once threw it back at me. Never once." That was Deel's other gift, the one that had nothing to do with maps. He never held it against anybody. All the mockery, the worst tent, the cartoon, the men who doubted him right up until his roots saved their lives, he let all of it go. Not because he didn't feel it. I think he felt everything deeply always, but because he'd decided that being right about the ground was worth more than being proven right to the people who doubted him. He didn't need the apology. He just needed the men to come home. We were at 23 now, the number that would end up in the story, the number they'd remember. But there was going to be one more. And the 24th is the one I've never been able to tell without stopping partway through. I've started to tell this last part out loud maybe a dozen times over the years, and I've finished it maybe twice. Bear with me. It was early summer. The mountains were as beautiful as they ever got, the snow pulling back off the high faces, water running everywhere, that hard country almost gentle for a few weeks. And a patrol went out into a section of the range that Deel hadn't fully mapped yet. It was on his list. He was working east to west and hadn't reached it. He'd told them as much. "I don't have good ground on that sector yet. Be careful. Don't trust the old imagery. I haven't checked it." They went anyway because they had to, and partway in they got into trouble, not enemy trouble, ground trouble, the oldest kind. A section of trail on the old imagery didn't exist anymore. A spring flood had taken it. And two of them ended up stranded on a shelf above a drop, in country where one wrong move meant the fall, and the light going, and no clean way to reach them. They radioed back, and the plan that started forming was going to take hours to organize, hours those men on the shelf might not have as the temperature fell. Deel was in the comms tent like always, and he stood up like always, and he said, "I can reach them tonight. There's an old works below that shelf. I saw the copper stain on the imagery weeks ago and flagged it. If it's what I think it is, there's a bench that runs right up under them. I can be there before midnight." The sergeant major said no. He said it hard. You haven't walked that sector, you said it yourself. You be trusting the picture from far away, the exact thing you tell everybody else never to do. And Deel, I will hear this until the day I die. Deel smiled a little, that tired smile, and said, I know. But somebody has to go stand on it, and I'm the only one who might read it right in the dark. Let me go find out if the old miners left me away. They usually did. He went, Prewitt went with him, and 2 others. I was not there. I have made my peace with a lot of things about that night, and I have never made peace with the fact that I was not there. They found the old works. The copper stain was exactly what Deel had thought, old diggings, and a bench running up beneath the shelf where the 2 men were stranded, just like the pattern he'd learned to read across a whole year of mountains. The miners had left away. He'd been right one more time, in the dark, on ground he'd never walked, reading it clean off 2 centuries of forgotten labor, and his own hard-won sense of how these mountains kept their secrets. They got up the bench. They reached the 2 stranded men. They got ropes on them and started bringing them down off the shelf, and it was working, it was all working. The 24th was going to be one more quiet miracle in a year full of them. And then a section of the old bench, ground that had held for 200 years, ground that had no reason to choose that night, let go. Deel was the last one on it. He'd put everyone across ahead of him, he always did. He'd sent the stranded men down first, and Prewitt, and the others, and he was bringing up the rear on ground he'd cleared for everybody else, and the ground he'd cleared for everybody else was the ground that failed. Prewitt told me he didn't even make a sound. That's what haunts Prewitt, all these years later, no cry, no curse. Just the sound of the rock, and then Deel wasn't there anymore. They looked, God, they looked all night and into the day and for days after. It was the kind of country that doesn't give anything back. They never found him. 23 missions, they'd counted at the medal ceremony. The 24th is the one that isn't in the official number because the 2 men on the shelf both lived, both came home, both walked off that mountain on the last route Marcus Deel ever read, but he didn't. So they left it at 23. 23 missions that changed everything. I've never agreed with that count. In my private ledger, it's 24. The last one cost him everything, and it saved 2 men who had children who have grandchildren now, and that has to count. It has to. They gave his terrible tent by the generator to no one after that. It stayed empty. Somebody moved his cot out, but they left the space, and for the rest of the time I was at Ellery, nobody put anything there. It just stayed, this small open patch of ground by the generator, the worst spot on the base, where the Mapmaker no one respected had lived and worked and gone out every dawn to learn the ground so the rest of us could come home. His maps outlived him by years. Units that never met him ran missions on the copper line and its network long after he was gone, and most of them had no idea whose feet had paid for every line. That would have been fine with him. He never wanted the credit. He wanted the map to be correct. He wanted men to come home. He got both, more than almost anyone I've ever known, and the price was himself, paid quietly, the way he did everything. I go up into high country still, when my legs will let me. And I'll tell you what I do, every time, before I trust any stretch of ground I'm not sure of. I go and stand on it. I feel whether it'll hold. I don't trust the picture from far away. And somewhere below the surface of it, if there's old digging, if there's a copper stain on the rock where men worked and were forgotten, I say a quiet word to a man who spent his whole life proving that the ones nobody respects are very often the ones holding everybody else up, and that the bravest thing in the world isn't the charge everybody cheers for. It's the man who walks the dark ground first, alone, so no one else has to fall. He always sent everybody across ahead of him. He was still doing it at the end.